sponsorship. We know that watershed work is inherently collaborative. We know it relies on partnerships, and there's lots of different ways that these partnerships can be created: formal, informal, fiscal sponsorship, sponsored projects, grants. And so Kelly's here to unpack some of those different opportunities for watershed work and answer any questions that you may have. So with that, Kelly, I'll hand it over to you, and we'll be back at the end of the program for some Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily and Jennifer, for having me bright and early this morning. This is, a little bit about me. I've been with the New York Council of Nonprofits for 27 years now. I started out as a fiscal office assistant as I was working on my graduate degree, and it quickly became a career, and I'm still 2 courses away from my graduate degree. So talk about career path differences. But I am Chief Operating Officer at NYCON and Executive Director of one of our nonprofit affiliates called Good Causes. NYCON is a statewide association of charitable organizations whose mission is to build the capacity of the nonprofit community that serves communities all across New York State. A little bit about Good Causes. We were founded in 1998. When I first started with NYCON, I was the bookkeeper internally for what we called our custodial group, the groups that we served as fiscal sponsor for. And me and my infinite wisdom, graduate studies, older student, blah, blah, blah. I said, why are we doing that under our auspices? And what we did was spin it out into a separate 501c3, formerly known as Innovative Charitable Initiatives. We changed the name a few years ago to Good Causes, which is much easier to say. But we offer fiscal sponsorship, employment administration, and a temporary home for programs in transition, which I'll talk more about as we discuss the various models for fiscal sponsorship. But throughout that process, we've learned a lot about being a fiscal sponsor, what we will do, what we won't do, and why. So I hope to share a little bit about not only how to do it, but some of the things to watch out for. Now, what is fiscal sponsorship? Let's just get right into the meat of this, okay? We've got a limited amount of time, and I usually do like 2 or 3 hours on a topic, so let me just get right in. Fiscal sponsorship is when a 501c3, a tax-exempt charitable organization, extends its legal and tax-exempt status to select groups engaged in activities related to the organization's mission. So for Good Causes, when we got its tax exemption, we made sure that we were broad in our mission statement because we wanted to reflect the diversity of the types of nonprofits that are members of NYCON, right? We're a statewide association of charities that are health and human services, they're arts and culture, they're watershed, they're volunteer fire companies. So our membership at NYCON it runs the gamut of, the charitable sector in New York State, with the exception of, now we have a lot of Cornell Cooperative Extensions, the individual groups as members, but like Cornell University, higher education tends not to be members of us. They've got their own association. Likewise, large healthcare, nonprofit healthcare providers, they have the Healthcare Association of New York State, but everybody else falls under our umbrella by and large. So when we started saying, well, what kind of fiscal sponsor clients might we take? We wanted that mission to be broad enough to allow us to be a fiscal sponsor for any of those types of groups that were emerging. So in our case, related to Good Causes mission can be any kind of charitable purpose, right? We do have some exceptions, but I'll talk about those in a bit. And why might you choose a fiscal sponsor? One of the things that caused the formation of Good Causes initially was, we had a large mental health facility that wanted to do a reevaluation program of people who had been institutionalized there, receiving care. And it didn't really fit within their rubric as an organization. So they came to NYCON and said, can you employ this staff person for us? We'll fund it, but we really want to do this study of, people who have been out of that setting for 6 months. And so we also had our custodial group. So what we did is we formed the C3. We also employed that staff person. We're fiscal sponsor for the initiative. And thus that entity was able to do that program that didn't really fit within their organizational structure. We also have a lot of emerging nonprofits that get together and are doing good work, but they have a promise of funding, but they're more of an alliance or just a collaborative, and there's really they're not incorporated. They don't have their own C3, but they have a promise of funding. So they can come to us and apply we have an application process on our website. They can apply for fiscal sponsorship from us. And then we can evaluate what they're doing, what the program looks like, and we can extend out our 501c3. But usually people come to us because there's either a program upcoming or they have a promise of funding already in hand and they need a C3 to do it. It also allows folks to attract funding for the operations that will be tax deductible to donors. You may have a community group that's doing, in your case, watershed work, protection of waterways, and local people want to donate, but they'd rather get the tax deduction if possible, or a corporation. So having a C3 to pass that through is attractive to those donors. And then, so there are 3 models. The academia on fiscal sponsorship has identified these 3 models. And there's actually a book available that's been around for years called Fiscal Sponsorship, Doing It Right. And that's sort of the way they have grouped the different models, and we'll talk about each one in turn. Model A is what Good Causes does. We are a comprehensive fiscal sponsor. When organizations approach us, we just had a board meeting yesterday, I'll share with you, and we approved an application. Right now in Metro New York, there are the Open Streets about to start up, the Open Street Initiative, where, business owners and nonprofits in a particular community, they open up the streets on certain days during the, block off traffic, and they have community activities during the summertime. And we just approved one of those yesterday. They have staff associated with those activities. So we'll be the employer of record. And we hold all the money. So they've already had some money in their coffers that they've been raising, but it wasn't, the folks that were contributing weren't getting the charitable deduction. They're going to transfer that money to us. They have a GoFundMe that has started. That's going to come directly to us, and we hold the money. They direct us when they want to cut checks, and we do that part of it too. So we hold the money. We're the employer of record, and they do the programming. We delegate the program activities away. And the idea of the way we do it is it's more of an incubator. We want people to be successful. We want to teach them the proper fiscal protocols as they go through the process with us, so that when they graduate, when they get their own C3, if they need to, then they graduate with the proper practices in place to be able to manage their own resources. And we charge by the hour, so they know the value of the accounting function of their nonprofit when they do move out to become their own 501c3. So the project integrates into our program. It's almost like a program of us. The personnel become employed by the sponsor. We receive directly the donations and grants. We also review the grants and make sure that it references us as the fiscal sponsor. We do the receipt and use of funds in R990. And we have a fiscal sponsorship agreement, a memorandum of understanding with those groups, and that articulates what our fees are. And we're responsible for all of the reporting, et cetera, associated with grants that our groups receive. And then we maintain control over the funds. So that's a comprehensive model. Employment, we're holding the money, we're administering the money, we're reporting on the money, and we charge an hourly rate for doing so. Now, some fiscal sponsors, right? Some of the large national ones, when you want to go to them to be a fiscal sponsor, they'll say, what's your budget? And they'll take a percentage of the budget. And we looked at that model when creating good causes. And we didn't think that was fair in our case, because we have, I'll give you another example. We have one group up in Western New York that does a particular kind of cancer awareness. Once a year, they do a run. They raise money, they pay their expenses, and then they contribute that money to a local higher education institution for research about that particular kind of cancer. Now, A, it's only once a year. B, they don't need to create a charitable entity to do that, because it's just one thing they do each year. And C, we don't think it's fair of us to say, okay, yes, we'll do this one thing a year for you, and you're going to give us 15 or 20% of the money you raise. So that's why we implemented an hourly rate, and people only pay us when they use us. There's no sense in someone paying us for when we're not active doing something for the group. That's our philosophy. But again, some fiscal sponsors just take a percentage of total budget each year as their fee. And again, here's sort of a graphic about that comprehensive model. So the funding comes to the sponsor, and the group is like a project or program of the sponsor. Grants, sponsorship, individual corporate donations are made out to the sponsor. And what I encourage groups to do is tell their donors to put their name on the memo line of those checks. And we have an accounting system that allows us to, within the company good causes, we have individual cost centers for each of our groups. So we can segregate funding by group. We can segregate it by funding source within a group. So we have a system that allows us that layer of accounting, basically. Now, Model B is where the charitable project operates independently, not directly by sponsor staff. The sponsor receives grant funds and disperses them to the project. Charitable contributions still come to the sponsor, and grants go out. The project reports income, expenses, maintains program liability, and it's a hands-off agreement. They manage their own funds. You know, we still have the responsibility for oversight, but they would have their own checking account. We don't do that. And the reason is, again, it's our C3. I was involved when we applied for the C3 status for good causes. And, the IRS, despite turmoil right now, they don't give those away. And I guard it with tooth and nail. And so I don't want an organization out there using our tax ID number that we're not holding the resources and administering them. So this is very similar, but it allows the groups to hold their own resources and report back to the sponsor. And then there's the Model C, which, if any of you have been involved in other charitable organizations, it's almost like a lead agency status, right? So the project, is a separate nonprofit legal entity, another 501c3. The sponsor receives the grant funds, disperses them to the project almost in a subcontractor way, right? So there's one grant that's held by the sponsor, but you subcontract the bulk of the funding out. And, in that case, the fiscal sponsor may take the administrative rate that is built into the contract. Charitable contributions go to the sponsor, and then the grants go out. Project reports income and expenses, maintains its own program liability. And again, it's a hands-off agreement compared to other models. And let me see. Yes, Model C. So pre-approved grant relationships, the money comes into the sponsor, but it's basically reimbursed to the grantee, and the project is a program of the sub-recipient. Let's put it that way. So sponsor holds the contract, subcontracts the work out to another individual 501c3. And, I sort of differ with the philosophy of calling that a fiscal sponsor relationship. It's not really. It's more a subcontractor relationship, or lead agency status for the entity that's receiving the contract. And, at NYCON, we've done that over the years several times. We were the lead agency for the Ryan White Care Network for a number of years, where we were the grant recipient, and we would sub out the work all over, up and down the Hudson Valley, out west, as far as Oneonta. And we just basically managed the master grant and then audited our subcontractors when they would submit vouchers to us for reimbursement. And those kind of, relationships are still out there. I'm not so sure in the watershed world, but like for state-supported childcare, state government has moved to, over the years, wanting to make fewer grants. So they make grants to a lead in a collaborative of organizations, and then this lead agency status requires less contracting on behalf of the state source. So being a fiscal sponsor, we're going to talk about each of these as quickly as I can, but as thoroughly as I can. The application, the contracts, finances, fee structure, and language to have in. The application, we have an online application at Good Causes. If you visit goodcausesinc.org, you'll see the 3 categories of services we provide. And if you click fiscal sponsorship, you'll see our application. It's built on form assembly. When someone submits it, it comes directly to me as executive director of Good Causes. Again, when those emails come to me, I share them with my staff, and then we determine first if that organization is suitable for us. So we receive the application. If it's suitable for us, if it makes it past me, it goes out to our board. And we've built in a process in our board that allows us to, as long as we have unanimous consent, we can approve those electronically. And then for the contracts, the requirements, contracts in our case is a memorandum of understanding that identifies the roles and responsibilities of each party. This is what Good Causes will do. This is what you're required to do. And we renew those every year. We used to have it where it would roll over annually and just renew and renew. And we decided, you know what, we want to take a look at those each year because things may change. One of the things we asked for, we have some blank lines. Tell us who is authorized to tell us to cut checks. And that's something that's very important to us. Another thing we ask for is there some sort of advisory committee? If you're not incorporated, do you have an advisory group? So that we know that it's just not one individual raising charitable money to reimburse themselves for activities. And we have seen that before. So we make sure that there's some sort of oversight body, and we even ask for minutes of that oversight body assigning that one person or two people the authority to tell us to disperse charitable assets. So things to think about. And, we've built our MOU over the years. When I started, it only had 2 pages, and now it's much longer than that. But we've expanded it as we've encountered an issue and said, you know what, we should build that into our memorandum of understanding. So the finances, and again, if you were to look at, because Good Causes is an affiliate of NYCON, a nonprofit affiliate of NYCON, and NYCON's board each year, NYCON is the sole member of the corporation Good Causes. I'm getting into the weeds here, but NYCON each year approves our slate of directors. So we're wholly controlled by NYCON, even though we're a separate entity. The control lies in NYCON's ability to approve our slate of directors. Now, what that means is, for NYCON's audit process, we're consolidated because we're a wholly controlled entity. We're consolidated into the NYCON budget process. We appear separately, but we're part and parcel, just like the other affiliates of NYCON, in that one audit. Now, that said, we're a separate corporation. We have separate accounting systems, and we can segregate, as I said, the funds that are the funds of our 17 groups that we act as fiscal sponsor for right now. And so if you were to look at the Good Causes balance sheet, you would see assets. We have a separate checking account for what we still call our custodial group. And you'll see a corresponding liability on our balance sheet because it's not our money. So we have a category called Good Causes Management in General. That's our operating budget, right? The rest of it is money in the door and a corresponding liability because it's not ours. So our assets appear in one line for cash. Our custodial group appears as an asset, but it's segregated, and there's a corresponding liability because it's not ours. And as long as if you're going to be a fiscal sponsor for somebody, as long as you understand we don't commingle that money with our own operating funds, we keep that separate. It's an asset and a corresponding liability. And then anything the group is paying us goes into our operating account. And we do so with actually cutting a check to whoever the sponsor is. So it's totally clean, totally segregated, and very clear to track what money you're removing from the charitable assets that you are stewarding. All right. So separate funds is super important. Separate accounts, sponsored projects, request budgets. That's one of the things we ask for right at the get-go in the application process. Attach a copy of a budget. If you don't have one, give us your best guess. Tell us where your funding you anticipate coming from. I mentioned these open street groups in New York City. One of the things that we're clear on is we won't administer a New York City contract. And some of those open streets initiatives get funding from the Department of Transportation in the city of New York. It's a complex process. We've had a bad experience with it, I'll be honest with you, just where, the project was already gone and it was almost a year till we got reimbursed for the project. So we just said, no more New York City funding unless, they cajole us in their promise of maybe an advance or something. But so we request budgets. If you're not sure of a budget, where do you think your money's going to come from? And we do have that caveat that we will not, administer city contracts. Payment requests. We have an online system where somebody can submit an electronic check request. They have to approve, or they have to submit also the substantiation for the expense. I want to see receipts. I want to see an invoice. And again, we're teaching people the proper protocols. Again, our model is viewed almost like an incubator. We're teaching them proper fiscal protocols. And then financial reports. We send financial reports at least quarterly. We have groups that want them more frequently than that. For us, it's just a point and a click and a few keystrokes, and we're able to kick out financials for each of our groups whenever they need it. And then online donations. And this is something we struggled with early on, which I think a lot of groups did. Excuse me. The online donation portals. It was a bit of a challenge for us because we had different groups using different online donation portals. We were fortunate over the last several years that we had somebody who was kind of half IT and half accounting, which was brilliant, who left me recently for a wonderful new opportunity, global in nature. But we miss her terribly. But while we had her, she helped us learn about the different donation portals that are available to organizations, and that we're not only limited to PayPal, which I understand has a little higher fees than some of the others. So here's a listing of some of the other payment portals. If you're selling stuff, you can use Shopify. There's WePay, Zephy, Square, Stripe. As the fiscal sponsor, though, you want to be aware of what donation portal tools groups that are under your auspices may be using, because you want them toggled to the account and clearly identified that it's for that group if you're doing more than one. So that's something we have to really work closely with these portal folks, or GoFundMe is another one, to make sure that funding is linked through our account. And if we have multiple groups using the same donation portal, we work with the donation portal folks to be sure that there's a clear identifier. If we have 17 groups and they're all using PayPal, and we just get a dump of money from PayPal, we need to know how to allocate it. So that involves communication with the PayPal folks to have a unique identifier for each. Language for grants and donations. Again, we're really clear. We give a little paragraph, a short one, 2 or 3 sentences to each of our groups to use when they're applying for grants. And we insist on seeing the grant before it's submitted, because we want to make sure that there's a reference to us as the fiscal sponsor, so that the grant maker or the corporation or whomever knows that the tax ID number is us, and we're a 501c3 domiciled in the state of New York. Many of our emerging organizations, they may be incorporated. We're still fiscal sponsor for them, but they have their own EIN number, employee ID number. So we're very clear to our groups, you're using our EIN, our tax ID number, when you're acknowledging grants and contributions. And typically the grant maker will want that grant to be in our name because we're the C3. So those kind of details, and making very sure that your groups understand that you're the C3, the grants are in your name, and it references the program or project that is under your auspices and how it's going to be carried out, and that they're responsible for. The relationship with the bank. We've got a great relationship with our bank. After many years of bouncing around from bank to bank who didn't understand the way we operate, we at any given time have about $2 million under management in our fiscal sponsorship group. And that can vary, but it can go up or it can go down. And it's very, very important that the banker that you're dealing with, you have one person to talk to, and they understand the relationship between your entity and your custodial group. And I find that if you take nothing else away, be very sure that your bank understands the segregation need, And we've got somewhat of a conflict or complex banking structure in that we have our custodial group, we still call it that. And we have a linked money market. And then we have our operating account and we have a linked money market. And we have one of our fiscal sponsor groups that has a very large amount of money. And they, because of the nature of the group, they wanted their own name on the checks. And for them, we made an allowance to let them have a separate account, although it's still in our tax ID number. They do work nationally and a very well-known individual. So we allowed that flexibility. So we have three checking accounts and 3 linked money markets. And it's a very good relationship with the banker, which makes it very, very, very helpful. And then fee structure, what will you charge? Will you be one of the groups that just takes 10 or 15 or 20% of a budget? Or are you going to charge an hourly rate? We have an engagement fee that sort of, and it's low. It's anywhere from $500 to $1,000 based on budget size. And that's just to cover our time and effort for processing the application, setting them up in our accounting system, verifying. We require that all of our groups have $1 million in general liability, just to protect us. We're loaded with insurance as a fiscal sponsor and professional liability insurance, general liability insurance, directors and officers liability insurance. So we're insured to the hilt because we have all these groups out there doing work under our auspices, but we also insist that they have $1 million in general liability, which usually is not that expensive. Why am I not advancing? Give me a minute. There we go. Lobbying. While I am a huge proponent of advocating and encouraging nonprofits to make their voices heard, lobbying is a thing. And I've heard nonprofits say, "Oh, but no, I'm just educating." No, you're lobbying. Lobbying is defined as any attempt to influence rate setting, regulation, be it state, local, municipality, or federal. And from an IRS perspective, we have to quantify that, right? So if Kelly Mathews, Chief Operating Officer of NYCON, we have an annual gathering of other state associations each year. I'm not going to go this year, but had I gone, I love to do the lobby day where we go up on the hill and we meet with our representatives and we say, we give them an earful. And there's strength in numbers when you get state associations from all over the country doing that, representing all of our members. There's power in that. But we have to quantify that. Now, for good causes, because we have 17 different groups, many of them operating in different states, we can't monitor that lobbying, whether they're lobbying or not. So in our MOU, we have a prohibition against lobbying for the groups operating under our auspices. In New York State, there's a hefty reporting requirement with JCOPE, the Joint Commission on Public Ethics. And you have to register as a lobbyist operating in New York State, which we do as NYCON every year. And we have to report on our lobbying activities, which we do as NYCON each year. But we just don't want to have to chase our groups down to do that reporting on their behalf. And we don't want to be responsible for missing it if they did do lobbying. So we just say, thou shalt not. Now, somebody else may do something different, but that's just we have a distinct prohibition and we have an affirmation we have people sign every year that they did not lobby. And again, the insurance we added, we asked that our groups have $1 million in professional liability and then mission alignment. And as I shared earlier, mission alignment with good causes is relatively simple because our mission is broad by design to mirror the broad membership of NYCON. fiscal sponsorship myths. And now we're, as Good Causes, we're a member of the National Network of Fiscal Sponsors. So that is nnfs.org. And I encourage you, and they have wonderful resources on their website. You'll find a listing of all the fiscal sponsors that are members of the National Network of Fiscal Sponsors. So if somebody, I use it as a referral tool. One of the things we won't do also is we won't work internationally. I've had groups come to me that say, I want to raise money to help girls in Somalia. And while I think that is a valid, worthy, good thing to do, in order to make grants internationally, it would require us, because of the Patriot Act, after 9/11, the Patriot Act was passed. And what the Patriot Act does, federal legislation, is it makes sure that US dollars, charitable resources, aren't going to support terrorist networks. And I happen to know Somalia is one of the danger countries, supposedly, according to it changes year to year, but it's one of the ones that is suspect. So if somebody came to us and said, we're a legitimate charity operating in New York State, but we're funding schools in Somalia for girls, we can't do that, because you have to be able to verify on the ground in Somalia that that's a legitimate charity with no ties to terrorist networks. And we just don't have that kind of international bandwidth. There are fiscal sponsors who do, though. So I always point them to a few that I'm aware of that do international work on the list of members at the National Network of Fiscal Sponsors. So some of the myth is, though, is all sponsored projects become their own independent C3, and the answer is no. We thought they would, but again, the cancer research group I mentioned earlier, they don't need to form a charitable organization for that. And the other very large group I mentioned, they don't want to become a 501c3. They want to do their thing. They want to raise money, quite a bit of it, and they want to make grants to do what their charitable purpose is. They don't want to become a fully functioning 501c3 with the administration of that. So we're basically their administration and their C3. Synonyms, you hear people say fiscal sponsor or fiscal agent or fiscal conduit. It's all the same. And then a fund, that a fiscal sponsorship equals a donor advised fund. Not really. Donor advised funds at community foundations belong to the community foundation. Now, the donor advises where they want those funds to be distributed, whether grant making or whatever, but it is only advice. The fund becomes the property of the community foundation. So that's very different than a fiscal sponsor. When we're fiscal sponsor for any of our groups, that money is not our money. That is hands off. And we cannot, under any circumstances, use those resources, even for temporary cash flow. It's not like deferred revenue that we hold internally as a charity that is money owed to a different period, and we can sort of dip into it and use it for cash flow. That's why we highly recommend that any money you're fiscal sponsor for is out of your operating eye in a separate account, to just take away the temptation to sweep into that money for cash flow, because it is not yours to touch. Donor advised funds are different, though. Some more myths from the National Network of Fiscal Sponsorship. Oh, we have this happen a lot. Somebody will contact us and say, I have a promise of a grant. It's due in 10 days. Can you be my fiscal sponsor? No, I'm sorry, we can't. We do have a process. It takes us at least 10 days. There have been times when we've moved much quicker than that, but I have board members who travel internationally and they're not always reachable. And as I shared before, we have a policy that says if I get unanimous consent, I can recommend and get approved one of our groups, but I can't do that. If I can't do that, I can't move that quickly. So the answer is always no. Fiscal sponsors limit programmatic freedom, and that's not true either. You know, as long as they're doing what they say they're going to do with the money they receive, as long as the program that they're operating is what they told us on their application, or if it changes, they notify us, that's fine with us. We're not limiting in terms of, you know, operating a program, as long as they do that legally and compliantly and within the context of who they want to be as an organization. We're not that controlling. Now, a little bit right here towards the end about tax exempt status. Let me check how much time I have here. Oh, I have a few more minutes. If you decide to, or if the groups that approach you decide to apply for tax exempt status, I mean, they have to do a couple of things. They need to incorporate in the state of New York. So organize as a not-for-profit corporation or trust, draft the organizing documents, obtain an EIN, and then apply for exemption with the IRS. And not all not-for-profits are tax exempt. I mean, there are a number of different 501c type organizations. And to apply for tax exempt status, you file a Form 1023 from the IRS, or Form 1024 for exempt status under another section of 501, such as a 501c4 that's an advocacy organization. There are several different kinds of nonprofits. The charitable status is 501c3, and it's the most coveted of all of the exempt statuses because we can receive charitable contributions that are deductible to the donor up to whatever the, you know, the current tax law allows. Likewise, businesses can contribute to us and get a tax deduction. Likewise, foundations can give to us, and it counts towards the required amount that foundations have to pay out each year. There is a certain amount they must pay out to 501c3 charitable organizations. So it's a coveted section of the code, and we guard it carefully. The benefits of exempt status, again, eligible to receive tax deductible contributions, no federal income tax paid on income related to exempt purpose, and a possible exemption from certain employment taxes such as federal unemployment tax, FUTA, maybe state income tax, sales tax, and sometimes property taxes. We're seeing more and more nonprofits that hold property being challenged on their property tax exemption, but ideally we are exempt from all of those. And we do need to collect sales tax in some cases if we're selling items, if we have a gift shop, etc. Requirements for C3 organizations must be organized and operated exclusively for one or more exempt purpose. And the following exemptions count: charity, educational, religious, scientific, which usually is where watersheds fall in. Literary, fostering national or amateur sports competition, cruelty to children or animals, and testing for public safety. And then you have to meet, in order to be charitable, you have to meet a public support test, which is 1/3 of the income of the charity over a 5-year moving average must come from public sources. Public sources can be government, it can be corporate or individual donations. It cannot include private foundation giving. And you'll get into a situation if you're dealing with foundations who give you a caution that, you know, you make sure that their contribution to you or their grant to you doesn't cause tipping. It's not tipping like I'm going to give you a tip. The concept of tipping is if I'm a small organization, let's say located in the Hudson Valley, and over 50% of my funding comes from a local foundation, over a 5-year period, if that grant from that foundation exceeds 50%, 3 of those years, that will tip me into private foundation status, because 1/3 of my support over the 5 years has to come from public sources. So it's an equation you have to do, but if organizations are heavily supported by one foundation, you really need to pay attention to this public support test and make sure that if you get that money year after year, and it's over 50% of your operating budget, operating revenue, that could tip you into private foundation status, because the IRS says, well, you're not operating like a public charity anymore. You're just another wing of that foundation. That's the rationale. But if organizations feel like eventually they want to become 501c3s and all the administrative things you have to do and the stewarding of other people's resources, which is exactly what we do as charities. Money doesn't belong to us. We administer it. We have an operating budget, and we do our good work as we go along. We do the best we can. And with that, how's my time, Emily?
You're great. Perfect timing.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Kelly. We have
Yes.
so many great questions. I know
Okay.
a lot of content, and Kelly and I were talking before we started the webinar that this is really a 101. So we're trying to give you a broad brush of a lot of different types of topics related to fiscal sponsorships and sponsored projects and 501c3. We know we've
Right.
got watershed groups who are interested in finding a fiscal sponsor. I know the Hudson River Watershed Alliance and other environmental organizations have been approached by watershed groups to be a fiscal sponsor. So we know that you all have slightly different scenarios, and we want to get into your questions. So just a note that Kelly has graciously offered to stay on the Zoom longer than 9:30. So I know
16 in the chat. Wow.
many of you have to go at 9:30, but for those of you who want to stay, we're recording this. We'll get this video out to you just so we can dig a little bit deeper into some of your specific fiscal sponsor project type questions. So I'm going to moderate the Q&A, and we've got some really great ones. So I want to start with one from a watershed group that's asking if you have any advice on how to select a fiscal sponsor, one over another. So we shared in the chat the Fiscal Sponsorship Network. We know Good Causes does fiscal sponsorship.
Right.
In Kingston, the Good Work Institute offers fiscal
Right.
sponsorship. So what kind of tips do you have? What questions should watershed groups be asking as they approach specific opportunities for fiscal sponsorship?
I'd look at structure. Do they have the capacity to serve you? Because even though you're using a fiscal sponsor, they are your fiscal administration. They're your administrative infrastructure. So, I've worked with groups that were being fiscally sponsored by a large hospital, and it would take forever to get a check cut. So can they effectively, at Good Causes, we cut checks every Thursday. In fact, when I get done here, I'm running into the office today to sign checks. But we do that like clockwork. It does a couple of things. It helps people batch information to us, and it costs them less to do it that way, as opposed to coming to us every single day. I need a check cut today. So we have structure that way. Our groups can know that, unless there's some unforeseen circumstances, we're going to run checks every Thursday. So they get all their information to us, and we run checks every Thursday. So that structure of understanding that you're going to get information you need on a regular schedule versus, again, being part of a larger organization that doesn't not necessarily make you a priority, but have the capacity to serve you in a timely manner. And look at hopefully they've got a written agreement that really clearly defines whose roles are what. I've done a lot of training on this, even nationally with other state associations about, inclusions in that agreement, and being really clear with both the group and the sponsor what the sponsor is responsible for. So if they don't have a written agreement, I'd be a little nervous about that. I would want one so that everybody's clear about who does what and when. But the main thing is capacity to serve you in a timely, regularly scheduled way. Especially if they're administering grants on your behalf. You don't want to be late to a funder on reporting or getting information to them because you can't reach your fiscal sponsor. So continuity, availability, structure would be my thing that I would look for.
That's great. And it sounds like the watershed groups, as they're approaching these potential fiscal sponsors, should have a really clear understanding about how frequently you would need checks to be cut, the timing of the
Absolutely.
work and the financial processes. So coming with that information as you approach these different entities will be really helpful in finding the right fit.
And I'll say, you know, I'm not saying use Good Causes, but if you go to our website, Good Causes Inc., goodcausesinc.org, and you click on apply, I mean, you don't have to apply, but look at the questions we ask. And that would be the information I would encourage you, even if somebody else doesn't have an application, to have that information ready to share with a potential sponsor. I mean, I want to know what the, you know, what is the mission, even though you're not necessarily an incorporated group yet. Where does your money come from? Do you have an advisory board? Do you plan to get tax exemption? So look at that application, just use it as just a reference point and have that information ready to discuss with a potential sponsor.
And I'll second that for any of the environmental organizations or anyone who's been approached to potentially be a fiscal sponsor to take a look
Right.
at that list too and see what information you might need as you're thinking about doing, whether it's a specific project or a more ongoing fiscal sponsorship relationship. So we've got a couple of questions about the different models that you laid out, Kelly.
Okay.
And one of them, to start with Model A, which was that comprehensive model, you mentioned that project personnel become staff of good causes. So we just want to clarify this relationship. So if people who are being paid under the project of that comprehensive fiscal sponsor model, are they covered as staff of good causes, like with workers' comp and insurance and
Yep.
benefits? How does that work?
Yep. So basically, you know, when designing Good Causes, we decided we were going to have a benefit structure that was lean by design, recognizing that most of the groups who approach us, who may at one point want to employ someone, can't afford. We had one group come to us, and their only option for employing a staff person to serve this big collaborative was the SUNY Research Foundation, and they were charging 32% fringe. And the group couldn't afford that, you know, even if everybody pitched in a little money to hire this coordinator position. So we made the decision when we started doing employment administration, we were going to be as lean as we could be. So we offered the New York State statutory fringe, workers' comp, New York State disability, and state unemployment insurance. And then we make available to staff employee paid a premium only plan for health insurance, dental, and vision, right? So if somebody comes to us and says, I want you to employ this executive director, and I want them to get 100% of their health insurance covered. Well, we can't offer different things to different pools of employees. So what we say is, well, you can augment salary. Here are the rates for the healthcare plans in their area. You talk to the person you want to hire, let them select their healthcare plan, and you add that onto salary so that the employee can, employee paid, buy into that healthcare. So that's the way we've found to do it, because we do have very distinct groups of employees, is that premium only plan. But yes, you know, communicating with people, making them understand who they work for, because we can delegate away the programmatic supervision, right? Just like you can in a nonprofit organization. You can say, okay, that's your supervisor, you report to that person. We can do the same when we employ staff on behalf of the groups we are fiscal sponsor for. But it needs to be very clear to the staff that we're the ones doing the hiring. We use a contract. We're still an employer at will, but we have a contract so that we connect with those individuals when they're placed, when they're hired, when they're selected by the group. We don't do the hiring or the search process. You bring us the people. We go through orientation. They sign a contract with us, but they're assigned to that project. And so we have our own personnel policies. We have them sign off on that. So we try to be just as clear as we can be. If somebody asks you where you work at Good Causes, but you're assigned to the project XYZ, and that has worked pretty well. But
That's
it
great.
takes a
Thank you.
lot of conversation so people understand, well, wait a minute, I work at such and such. You're assigned to them, but you work for Good Causes.
So I want to note that it's 9:30. So if you have to go, please feel
Okay.
free to go. But we have so many more questions. And
Oh,
so
I
we're
have
going
a
to
few,
stay on the line with
I have
Kelly,
time.
and we're going
Yep.
to keep recording this. So you can come
Okay.
back and get the answers to your questions, hopefully, if you do have to go. So
All right.
I want to thank you, Kelly, for describing that. So with Model A, the paid staff people are, in fact, employees of Good Causes, as
Causes.
opposed to a contractor relationship, which was Model B.
Right.
And we don't need to get into the details between
That's more like a
staff.
lead agency. That entity's out there on its own. It employs its own staff. It's incorporated, and we're merely the lead. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. And yeah, so there's a big distinction between an independent contractor and an employee dynamic, and we're not going to get into it today because this is 101, but if you ever want to go into 201, please let us know. We have a question about Model C as well, a fiscal sponsorship related to that grant funding relationship. What are the benefits of that model, and where should groups consider that grant funding fiscal sponsorship dynamic as opposed to Model A or B?
Well, and again, I disagree with the National Network of Fiscal Sponsorship. To me, it's not fiscal sponsorship if you've got two 501c3 entities doing business together, right? It's more to me, given my history with an organization that's been a lead agency for a number of large grants that were subcontracted out. To me, that's more of a lead agency subcontractor model. And, the benefits are again, I would look at structure of the lead. Do they have the capacity? Because in that case, you've got one sort of master contractor, and that master contractor is subcontracting for the actual work. So you guys are out there doing the work, making the payroll. I would be sure that when I submit my voucher or whatever the process is to draw my percentage of that master contract down, that they have the capacity to be timely in the reimbursement. Now, I know our fiscal team for years spent a lot of time auditing our subcontractors' submissions. So there was time involved in that, and many of them were very large, complex grants too. So we were receiving payroll information and verifying it to the budgets of the individual subs. So for doing that, just like, fiscal sponsorship, you look at capacity. Now, the benefits of an application like that, again, more and more state agencies in New York State are looking to consolidate their contracting process because it's less that the state agency has to monitor. And the benefits of applying through a lead with multiple other organizations are economies of scale, A, and it can often, depending on, the kind of money you're applying for, it can often be a stronger proposal. But when you're joining into that collaborative that is submitting through a lead, you want to be really, really clear. What is your portion of that budget? What are you accountable for? What is the reporting that you have to do? What is the voucher? What is the reimbursement mechanism? And make sure that is super, super clear, because that also involves a contract with the lead agency. If the lead agency is doing a good job, let's put it that way. I mean, it should be ironclad, written down, and extremely clear to all parties working with that lead agency.
So it sounds like with the models, and so correct me if I'm wrong, the
Right.
models A and B are sort of a more ongoing relationship of
That's right.
banking and fiscal sponsorship. So you may be doing individual donations, or there's
Right.
money regularly coming in, even if it's like the
Exactly.
run, like it's one time a year, but it's sort of every year, as opposed to
Right.
the grant funding model, sponsored project model C, that might be more discrete timeline. The grant starts here, it goes for 2 years,
Right.
it ends, and then that relationship is
Yes.
over. Is that
Yes.
right?
Yep. Yep. Exactly right. It's just like, contracting with New York State, but you're doing so through a third party that's merely a pass through. And usually the lead will take a percentage, the administrative percentage, or a portion of the, a vast portion of the administrative reimbursement on those contracts. Again, that's why you sit down, you hammer that out. Okay, this is the initiative 3 of us and 1 lead are going for. Here's the amount of money available. What do I get? Here's my budget. Here's my staffing. Okay, what's that? That's a negotiation, but it can be a stronger proposal that way. And the state, again, over the last 10, 15 years has really looked at consolidating the number of contracts they have to give. It's very unique to each funding source though. So that's a generalization that may not apply.
Sure. Another question on grants.
Mhm.
So I'm just going to read this. In which models would the sponsor be responsible for requesting reimbursement funds from a state or federal agency funding the project? And who would write the quarterly or interim or final reports that would be submitted to a funding agency?
Okay, that's an easy one. So the sponsor does the drawdown. The report writing on programmatic activity is the sponsoree. Because we've administered a number of different grants, a couple of federal ones too. And one was an AmeriCorps program, for instance. I have no idea by looking at the expenditures what the programmatic activity and the outcomes were for that program. So the programmatic reporting, all the narrative that goes along with the numbers is the program, because we're not actively delivering that. We're collecting the financial information based on expenditures that we've approved, and we've cut the checks or we've run the payroll, and we submit it up to whatever portal. We do that part. But if there are any narratives due, or quarterly narratives, or any kind of reporting like that, totally the responsibility of the group doing the program, because we're not program people. We oversee it, we administer the funding, but we're not on the ground delivering program.
And I'm assuming that ideally that would be included in the contract, in the agreement, the
Absolutely.
relationship, that level of detail of exactly
Yes,
what you
ma'am.
want.
We want to be super, super clear, especially when there's staff involved. We have contracts all over the place. We have what we call a grant source agreement, which is the agreement with the group that we're going to employ staff for, which is, again, employment administration versus fiscal sponsorship, or could be both. If we have a fiscal sponsor client who wants to hire people, they also execute that contract as well as our MOU for fiscal sponsorship. But we just want everybody to be super, super clear what their responsibilities are. So if we need somebody to be clear on something, we put it in the MOU. And so programmatic reporting, very clearly articulated in our MOU.
That's
And
great.
again,
Thank you.
just for rational reasons, I'm not on the ground. I'm not hanging out with you watching you do your stuff, so who better to write about it with passion and purpose than the people on the ground doing the work?
Yeah,
I'm a
absolutely.
recovering English major too, by the way. So I love, I could write all day long, but I would rather somebody with that passion and purpose and direct firsthand knowledge of the activities write that up.
Absolutely. And I know one thing that we've heard from people who are responsible for the grant is that risk of what happens if my sponsoree doesn't do the reporting that they're required, and I'm on the hook for that with the funder, and then what happens? And that's where you want to have that contract really clearly laid out so that you
Right.
can enforce or really make sure that those risks are reduced.
And one other thing along those lines, and this is worst case scenario, we've terminated relationships before. Where somebody doesn't follow through. We have a termination clause in our MOU, with or without cause, with 30-day notice. Because if we get wind of somebody doing something inappropriate, which is never happened, I've never got wind of somebody doing something illegal or whatever, or any sort of harassment or anything like that. But if somebody's not communicating with you, and reports are due, and we're on the hook to do them, and we have been in that position before. Unfortunately, we can piece it together a little bit, but it's not nearly as robust. That was actually the city contract, which made us say we're never going to do city contracts again, because we got stuck holding the bag on the reporting on that, and had to sort of pull it out of air and financial information to do any kind of narrative at all. But when the sponsoree doesn't perform, and that's, we give a written warning, we'll give another written warning. We had somebody that went negative, using the credit card, and we reached out and reached out and reached out and reached out, and they finally made reimbursement. We termed them immediately afterwards, because just that lack of communication and irresponsibility, honestly. We just said, okay, we don't need to play that game anymore. We don't have
And
the
so
capacity. We need to focus on the people who are doing good work and that we work with actively.
So for the entities that are thinking about doing this, but concerned about that risk and the roles, it sounds like you can really get out ahead of it by being really clear up front what the expectations are
Absolutely.
and what happens if expectations are not met,
Right.
so that there's a very clear process of the warnings until, potentially the relationship is dissolved. Yeah, go ahead, Kelly.
And I'll say, that's one of the reasons we asked to see the grants up front too, before they're submitted, because we look through to see what is required of this grant. Is it a monthly narrative report? And then we can talk to the group and say, okay, there's this monthly narrative report in here. You're going to do that. And we point to the MOU, see, it says this. So before any grant is submitted, we want to see it in advance. And we look for the language that references the fiscal sponsor, and we look for the reporting schedule. Is it cost reimbursement, or do they get in advance? Because if it's cost reimbursement, they're going to need to front money for the expenditures, and we look at the balance in their account to see, are they going to be able to front those expenditures? Because they have to have cash in the bank in order to do a cost reimbursement contract, because we don't front the program expenditures. So even looking at contracts and grant applications, RFAs, to be sure that the implications on the sponsor, for cash flow, for monitoring, for reporting, and just open communication with the groups, to be very, very, very clear. Maybe even, slapping on an addendum to your MOU for a particular grant that says, okay, and further, for CFDA number da 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 da, these are additional requirements of each party. Just so you have that in writing, somebody signed off on it, everybody's clear.
That's great. Thank you. And we're going to continue down this road of risk management.
Okay.
You mentioned that Good Causes requires the $1 million in general liability insurance.
Correct.
Could you
Yeah.
talk a little bit more about the need for liability insurance?
Yeah, I mean, and again, so we're the 501c3. It's our tax exempt status. We're loaded with insurance. But if our group is located in Manhattan, or actually, no, that's a bad example. I'll use the one that we used to have. It was a Stop DWI program, and each weekend they would set up a big display in one of the local malls here in the capital region. And someone, they would give out things and, awareness things about stopping DWI, driving while intoxicated, et cetera. And they gave away things. And they had this little game thing where you sort of played this game with the hammer and the thing goes up and, you were trying to do it. But somebody got hurt with the little game thing. And I mean, like not seriously hurt, but hurt nonetheless, requiring an ambulance ride to the hospital. So whose liability is that? Now, they were an entity beneath a county, right? So theoretically, the county has the liability, but we were the fiscal sponsor. And they were actively soliciting contributions with our tax ID number at that event. So whose liability is that? And I'm originally from Arkansas, by the way, which is where the twang is from. Born in Oklahoma, but grew up in Hot Springs, Arkansas until I came to New York. One thing I learned about coming to New York, it's very litigious. And if someone's going to sue, they're going to sue everybody involved in that game thing that was at the mall in the capital region. So that is why groups that you're sponsoring need their own general liability. Anything can happen. If you have people who are driving from one location to another, if you have, employees, which again, if they're employed by us, they're covered by us. But if they're on your property or at one of your events on, I fly fish in the West Branch of the Osable River. And we're doing a fly fishing clinic and somebody gets too close to the Wilmington flume and goes down the flume. Whose responsibility is that? So there's every good reason to have general liability. Anything can happen. And you want to protect the sponsor. So we're loaded with, but we also want our groups to be protected as well.
That's great. Thank you. And I know there are some specific examples where, for example, if we're hosting an event in partnership with a Watershed group, we'll provide a certificate of insurance where you're on our liability insurance for a very low risk event. And so there may also be, again, thinking about the grant or the very isolated project, maybe it's an event, there may be ways to get access to other insurance coverage, but you'll want to be really clear about who's covering what in case of any issues for this overall risk management.
Right. I think you can't have too much. Honestly, $1 million, is really relatively low. We do have the ability to. It depends on the risk of the project. I'll share this. It depends on the risk of the project. If a project comes to us and we deem, and it's more of a research project, we do have one umbrella general liability policy that will allow people to buy into, but it's a very low risk activity versus, let's say, the open streets thing that we talked about earlier. You have people in the community come in, people can bring their dogs. I'm a dog owner. I have 4, big dogs, but people can bring their dogs into a big, loud community with live music and blah, blah, blah. Is there risk associated with that? You betcha. As a dog lover, but again, you have all these people communing in a big open space and on a downtown street that's been closed off. Is there a potential for liability there? Absolutely. So they're going to have their own. We won't bolt them onto our low risk tolerance GL. But it's pretty affordable. We also happen to have an insurance brokerage affiliate called Counsel Services Plus. He works with a lot of our groups and finding them an affordable option for that $1 million. So
Great, thank you. Yeah, and continuing down this risk management, I'm going to actually take this one. So
Okay.
the question around the lobbying considerations. So if a group completes a watershed restoration project and invites a local representative, whether it's state or local, to tour the project and talks about the importance of funding projects and showing the benefits to the environment, is that lobbying? And so we've done a lot of digging into, we just created an advocacy policy ourselves, really dug into the
Okay.
definitions of this for the Hudson River Watershed Alliance's work. That would not be considered lobbying. That
Correct.
actually would be education. So Kelly was distinguishing between education and lobbying. Where it would come into lobbying is if it was in regards to a very specific policy, piece of legislation, budget line. And so when you invite, it's so important to connect with our elected officials at all different
Agree.
scales and to show them the value of watershed restoration and take them on those tours and educate them on the importance of our waters and watersheds. And so don't be concerned about that. That education is so, so critical. It's when it is in regards to a very specific piece of legislation that it becomes lobbying, and different entities will have different requirements. So Kelly mentioned that good causes has a no lobbying. Other
Right.
entities, it might need to be an insignificant amount of your time or expenses. So just to be really clear, and then thinking through that, we had that question about how do you know if it's a good fiscal sponsorship relationship? That might be one of the questions you ask, is to get some clarity if that lobbying role is really important to your group, how you might navigate those dynamics.
And I'll just add on to that. So your scenario is a perfect example of, yes, you're showing your elected, the good work you've done with stewarding the resources of taxpayer dollars, and look at this wonderful work. And here's the important. The minute it becomes lobbying is when you say, I think you should go back to Washington and increase that budget line, or replenish that funding. Or, so the minute you do a call to action to the elected, it becomes a lobbying activity. So it's also just understanding that differentiate. It's you can certainly say, look at the appropriation that you help support. Look at this wonderful work we've done with it. The minute you say you should fund it again and fund it more, that becomes a call to action and sort of changes the flavor of the activity.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a question about the entities that Good Causes provides a fiscal sponsorship for. I know you work with groups all over the state. Do you work with any farmers markets? Do you work with any other kind of local environmental type
We
organizations?
had a co-op that was kind of a local grocer co-op right before COVID, actually. And then during COVID, unfortunately, it was what it was, and they tried to keep going and just couldn't during COVID, and they haven't come back to us. But and we did a farm. Um, I'm usually really good at remembering things like that, but we have done a farm that it wasn't an animal sanctuary, but it was more of an educational retreat slash farm slash environmental stewardship, a little bit of the CSA model woven in. It was kind of difficult to put a finger on them. They wanted to develop a lot of things around this farm. And so we sort of hung on with them for a while, and they did get their own 501c3 eventually as more of an educational retreat center. But so, even having a sponsor that's willing to kind of go on that journey with you is important, I think, because it's just like, as a young person entering college, you have a really clear idea of what you want to be when you grow up. And then as you start doing that work, maybe you gravitate more towards this. It's a good idea to have that exploration before you apply for your 501c3. Let me just share that little drop of wisdom.
And speaking of that, Kelly, so we also have a question from a watershed group that has submitted their 501c3.
Okay.
And it's taken them quite some time to hear back about the status. So they are an entity, they have an EIN, they submitted all their paperwork, and they haven't heard back. in about a year. Do you have
Uh,
any advice on groups that are in that interim stage where they've submitted
keep
all the requirements?
calling.
But
Yeah,
that's still helpful that the 6 months to a year is a normal
is a
timeframe. So if it's just
normal.
been a
Yes,
year, follow up and make sure that we get, any
absolutely.
updates, but that's not unheard of in
Right.
that particular process. I have one more question,
Okay.
which is around a slightly different model that we've seen from some of our watershed groups in the Hudson Valley, where the watershed group may not be, it wouldn't be incorporated, it wouldn't be its own entity, but they receive staff support from a particular larger nonprofit. So there might be a staff person at a bigger environmental organization that's providing time to coordinate or maybe do the agendas or book the meeting space, right? So part of their staff role at that organization is to facilitate the watershed group, but the watershed group is not an entity. They're being paid for their time, but it's not. So is there a particular model for that kind of approach? Do you have any recommendations for that kind of model or structure?
Well, it's like in kind, right? If I'm an entity, and someone donates staffing to me and expertise to me or consulting or whatever the case may be, accounting services, that's an in-kind contribution. And I don't know that there are written contracts for, obligating that in-kind contribution to that level where the entire staffing is donated from another entity. Me being me, I'd want that in writing. Okay, what are you going to give me? Because otherwise, without that contribution, you need to figure out how you're going to hire somebody to do that work or have independent contractors. So, and there's value to that in kind. So when you're a 501c3 and someone gives you that, you have to quantify it and report it on your financials as a thing, an intangible thing, but a thing nonetheless.
Yeah,
So
that's a really important reminder that time is money and that
exactly.
it's not a gift. It actually is, well, an in-kind contribution that could be calculated as part of the group's operating budget, that
That's
it is
right.
in kind, but if that in-kind service went away, it would need to be replaced by funding to then have that same service of group coordination and all of those other aspects.
And there are cases where you can use in kind, especially when it comes to professional services and staffing, as match.
Great.
In kind can sometimes, depending on the funding source, count as a match.
Great. Well, we have to wrap up. It has been
Yep,
so wonderful to
we
have
do.
you, Kelly. Thank you
You're
so much for
welcome.
staying on and answering some extra questions. We do have one other question. If you take on subcontracting work as an advisor, I think the answer is yes, but maybe reach out to you to see if you want to work with Kelly through
Oh,
NYCON. The
yes.
good
Oh,
job
yes,
is
yes, yes. We do that. Yeah, we do that through NICON. Yeah.
perfect. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to the Hudson River Estuary Program and NEIWPCC. Funding from the New York State Environmental Protection Fund has sponsored today's program. We're so grateful for your continued
Thank
support.
you.
We'll be sending out an email with links to resources and the recording to this video and more information. So we look forward to seeing you at World Water Day in Kingston on Saturday, March 22nd, at the Wavemaker Awards benefit on Wednesday, June 11th, and next month, April 13th, I think it is, at our next webinar on the Bronx River Watershed new watershed management plan. So thanks so much, everyone. Hope you have a great day. Thanks again, Kelly.
Bye.